Hi, I'm Adam Porter. I'm a board game designer from Wales, and today I'm going to show you, in quite a quick video hopefully, 10 books which I've used to improve my board game design, and hopefully you might find some of these interesting too. It's quite a wide, sort of diverse selection of books, some of them very specifically about board game design and some of them about creativity in general, or product design and product placement and those sorts of things. But the first book on the list is the Kobold book of board game design. Now this is a fairly small book. It's actually quite old now. I got this, I think, probably about 10 years ago. Mine is a 2011 edition. I think there's a later edition. But this is a book that's full of essays by different board game designers and board game creators, like it's Mike Selinker, James Ernest, Richard Garfield, Steve Jackson, there's Andy Looney in there, there's all sorts. And it's quite an eclectic mix of different sort of essays, basically, short essays about different aspects of board game design and board game production. So there's not a sort of consistent through line. But what this book is really good at is giving you a very basic sort of introduction to the whole process, from creating the game originally to playtesting to production, how the industry kind of works. Now I will say this was written before the real surge of Kickstarter games. Kickstarter didn't really exist. I hesitate to say it didn't exist in 2011, I can't be sure of that, but it was brand new if it did exist, okay? So it wasn't the thing that it is now, and of course digital playtesting and digital pitching really wasn't a factor. But nonetheless, these essays are still really sort of relevant, and I think as a sort of primer, an introduction to board game design, I think it's still really good. Be careful if you're buying this one, because there's quite a few different books that are called the Kobold Guide to, and I think the Kobold Guide to game design is a different thing to the Kobold Guide to board game design. Some of them get into RPG creation and stuff like this. So careful which one you're buying, but I think that's a good primer. Number 2 on the list then is Gametek. This one is by Jeff Engelstein, and this is it's similar in a way in that it's an eclectic mix of different essays, all by the same author this time. And these are essentially transcripts of the various different little tiny podcast episodes that Jeff Engelstein used to do for the Dice Tower. So the Dice Tower would produce their big podcast, and Jeff Engelstein would have a segment where he'd discuss some aspect of gaming, often about the psychology of gaming, or about the science behind different design decisions, or about randomness. There's articles about like the prisoner's dilemma and how that's been used in games. All sorts of really interesting and very diverse different topics in this book. I love it because it's easy to dip into, because those segments on the Dice Tower are very short. You know, we're talking like a minute or 2 minutes. So they make for very short essays, which means it's really nice to dip in, read 1 or 2, move on, you know, to something else, come back to it, read 1 or 2, and they're always inspiring and really get your mind working in a slightly different way, okay? It's quite a challenging book in that regard, but very easy to read. So I'm a big fan of that one, Gametek by Jeff Engelstein. Book 3 on my list is, this is not a board game design book. This is called Steal Like an Artist, okay? And it's a book all about creativity, but I find this one really, it's almost like a sort of mission statement or a motivational book or something like that. And it's really beautifully sort of produced with these stylish sort of images which just summarize the key points. I thought this was really interesting. The key message, of course, is a bit eye-grabbing, isn't it? It's a bit attention-seeking, this idea of steal like an artist. And the book makes it clear that we're not talking about plagiarizing here, but the whole focus of the book is how artists build on previous artists' work, right? They borrow stuff, they develop it. And this book talks about when that's a good idea, when it's inappropriate, how to do it, and so on. But it goes into so much more than that. It also promotes the idea of sharing your ideas with other people and how much you can benefit from that. So if you have a look at a couple of quotes in here, this one is from Francis Ford Coppola. We want you to take from us. We want you at first to steal from us, because you can't steal. You will take what we give you and you will put it into your own voice, and that's how you'll find your voice. And that's how you begin, and then one day someone will steal from you. I mean, this is just great advice for board game designers, just as it is for any artist. I also really liked this quote from Howard Aiken, who is, I think he was somebody important in IBM, that organization. It says, don't worry about people stealing your ideas. If your ideas are any good, then you'll have to ram them down people's throats. And this is a book that's full of those sort of quotations, those quippy little remarks. But actually there's just really good advice in here about looking after yourself as well as a creative person, about keeping your body in good shape, your mind in good shape, and everything else. I think this is just a really good little motivational book for anybody who's doing anything creative, and it certainly relates to board game design. Next on my pile of books, I've lost count of where we are. Are we number 4 now? This one is a very specifically a game design book. This is Dice Games Properly Explained, and this book is by Rainer Knizia, who, if you've been watching my videos, you'll know is my favourite designer, frankly. I've got so many Rainer Knizia games. He's produced, I think he's published something like 700 games at this point. And this book's been around for a long time, okay? So he's presumably had less than, well, it says in the back he's got 500 games. So this was 200 games ago, okay? And this is it's quite a mathematical book. It talks a lot about statistics. These dice games he's talking about, we're not talking about, Roll for the Galaxy here. What we're talking about is very simple games, and I just like it as a sort of starting point for designing a dice game. It talks about the sort of games that have been played over generations, and betting and gambling, and how these different dice games work. And I think it's a good starting point that you could kind of build on when you're creating your own dice games. Next up is another book by Jeffrey Engelstein, and this one also by Isaac Shelev, and this is a monster of a book. Look at the size of that. It's also quite expensive. This is quite an academic book in a way, and I think it's essential. I think this is probably essential for any serious game designer, because what this is an encyclopedia of game mechanisms. They've tried to put everything in there and categorize them together. And essentially this is the book that the Board Game Geek, if you know the Board Game Geek website, this is the book that their classification is based off. They've kind of done it in conjunction together. It's really nicely written, it's really beautifully illustrated. There's these nice icon-based pictures of these mechanisms. I think they're by Daniel Solis, I believe is... Yes, that's right, it's Daniel Solis. Daniel Solis is a great game designer in his own right, but he's done these fantastic icon-based images through this that really just sort of lift it. This is not your sort of bedtime reading, okay? This is more of a reference book that you're going to dip into. If you're exploring a certain mechanism, it'll tell you other games that have used that mechanism. It'll tell you very similar mechanisms that maybe you haven't considered that relate to that. Mine is the first edition. I believe there's a later edition that's got even more included in it, but it's a hefty old tome. But I think, as I say, I think it's essential for any serious board game designer to have a copy of this to hand. Next on my list then is a book which I don't actually have a physical copy of because I downloaded it on Audible and I listened to it while walking the dog. So this is a book that was called Obviously Awesome. And it's not specifically about board game design. In fact, it doesn't mention anything about board games at all. This is a book about how to place your product in a market and make sure that it gets noticed, make sure that it doesn't get lost, and how certain products, if they're put into the wrong market, or if you don't know what your market is, if you promote it in the wrong way, if you shape it in the wrong way so that it appeals to the wrong people, or if you don't get it in front of the right people, even if it's a great product, it's going to fail. So it's about product positioning, and it's just an excellent book. It was really thought-provoking for me, and it's inspired a lot of what I talk about in my videos. I tend to spend a lot of time talking about games as products. I think as game makers we don't do that enough. We focus so much on designing what we like and what we would like to play without really thinking about the end user, and this book certainly pushes you much more down that path of thinking, where am I going with this? Who's going to end up playing it? And how can I give it the best possible chance of reaching those people and really appealing to them when they discover it? And the next book is Characteristics of Games. This one by George Scaff Elias, Richard Garfield, who you'll have heard of, and K. Robert Gutschera. And this one is a big book, lots and lots of text, small text, and it's again fairly academic, but it's really interesting in terms of the way that it breaks games down. It does it sort of in a very objective way. It tries to define a lot of things, come up with lots of different definitions. I think some of the definitions are new specifically for this book and may have been adopted into sort of gaming jargon since then. but it sort of focuses on the smallest parts. This book calls them atoms, the smallest parts of games, the smallest parts of gameplay, and then sort of broadens out to look at all the different aspects of games and gameplay that come together. It's a really interesting read, a really sort of detailed look at the constructions of games. So Characteristics of Games, highly recommended. Again, slightly academic alongside the building blocks of game design, but that's all right. Okay, that's you know, you can read your nice little breezy Kobold guide to game design if you want a basic introduction. You can read your breezy creativity book in Steal Like an Artist. But if you want something hefty, I think this is a good one. And actually, the next book on the pile is similarly sort of hefty and has a similar remit actually in terms of defining things and stuff like that. But that's not the reason I like this book. Challenges for Game Designers. It says non-digital exercises for video game designers. So this is sort of encouraging video game designers to explore board game design to inspire their video game stuff. Now, I'm not a video game designer, but I still found it really interesting reading. Sometimes I find it interesting looking at how video games are kind of created and videos around video game design and seeing how that relates to board game design and where those designers tend to have gone off on a different path, or they use different terminology than the terminology we might use in you know, analog tabletop game design. But nonetheless, what I find really good in this is it's full of challenges. It's full of design challenges for designers to get them thinking, okay? And some of them are really basic and they're about, you know, learning about the craft of board game design, but other ones are just really good starting points for a design. It's if you're, you know, if you've got designer's block, right? You're sat at your table, you're thinking, I want to design something, but I don't really know where to start, then pulling this out and just picking a challenge and having a go at it might inspire something. Or if you're working on a game design that you really, really want to work, but you're stuck, it's not working, sometimes the best thing is to put that on the shelf and work on something else. And maybe pulling this book out, picking out a challenge and having a go, that might be the thing that kind of unlocks or creates something totally new. So it's a, you know, it's a good sized book. Some of it, certainly towards the end, it gets a little bit video gamey, but the majority of it is really applicable to board game design, and I think it's quite thought-provoking, this book. Next on the list then is another book which I haven't got a physical copy of, another one that I've listened to on Audible. This one is called Ego is the Enemy, and it's not specifically about board game design, but it is, a lot of it's around, it's not even about product design really, it's a general sort of, again, another motivational sort of manifesto for how we should lead our lives as creative people. Yeah, Ego is the Enemy is the name of the book, and that really is the message of the book as well. The book is promoting kind of lifting other people up, right? Not worrying so much about your own ego, trying to find ways to get over the rejections and all those things which inevitably we meet as game designers, but instead to focus on lifting other people up, and the benefit of that is, of course, that other people are going to do the same for you. It sort of comes back around. I suppose that's what I'm doing when I'm making these videos. I'm trying to help other game designers. Does that mean that I get helped myself? Well, maybe not directly, but I receive so much help from other game designers that I've met, and I have done for many, many years, that this feels like my sort of version of giving it back. I might not be giving it back directly to them, but I'm passing it on, right, to other people, to the viewers. And that's kind of what this book is all about. It's about trying to hold back your own ego, which can only ever sort of stop you progressing. Another thing that I particularly jumped out at me in this book is he talks a lot about how we ought to do more and talk less, right? And that actually a lot of people who are creative people actually end up procrastinating an awful lot by talking about what they do rather than actually just getting on and doing it. And it did make me think about these videos. I spent an awful lot of time making these videos and posting them on YouTube when that really does eat into my design time. So would I be better off spending that time on design? That's a question for me to consider, okay? But yeah, it certainly got me thinking, this book, about my design time, my work-life balance, the way that I respond to bad reviews, to rejections from publishers, where I can help other designers and so on. Okay, so good book, Ego is the Enemy. And the final book on my list is a journal. It's called the Fail Faster. It's a playtesting journal, okay? Now, I originally backed this as a Kickstarter, and so I've got a PDF, so I tend to print off this journal onto blank sheets, and then it's essentially a journal that you fill in with every playtest. So you're writing down who your playtesters were, you're writing down how long the game took, you're writing down which rules you've changed since your last playtest, what you wanted to get out of your playtest, what you saw, what was the winning player's strategy, what did you like, what do you want to improve. But it's also full of these little tips that just sort of come up along the way. So at the bottom of each page, there's a nice little tip. There's other useful things in there, like there's a randomizer where you can flip through the pages and it'll give you random numbers which you can use in your tests. But it's a very structured way of approaching your playtests, and I think it was a couple of years into my design, if I hesitate to call it a career, my design side career. Okay, it was a number of years into that before I really started logging things in this specific way, and it's so useful because time can pass and you forget why you introduced that rule or why you changed that rule. So you go back to the previous rule, having forgotten that it never worked and why it didn't work. A book like this really helps to log those changes, why you made those changes, where the game's working, where it isn't, and gives you direction to move forward. As I say, I had this as a PDF. You can buy a physical copy. I think you can get it from the Game Crafter. I think that's where it's sold, but you can also download PDFs online, I believe. You'll have to Google it, look it up. Fail Faster, the Playtesting Journal. And so that's it. That's my 10 recommendations to you. Those are the 10 books that have been most helpful to me as a board game designer over the years. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please go back and watch some of my others. There are videos about all manner of different board game design topics. There's enough topics in there for me to write a book. Maybe I should. Okay, go back and look. Go back and look through. Scroll back, way back. Okay, not just the last few videos. I've been making these videos for years about board game design, so hopefully you'll find something that covers your burning questions about your own board game designs. Please subscribe to the channel, share the video, comment. I love it when you comment and I can, correspond with you, communicate with you through the comments. And I'll see you on the next video. Until then, all the best.